chain of responsibility and solidarity, making millions of people here in America and around the world into agents of social change, able to accomplish much more together than as isolated individuals. That movement gives voice to the hopes and values and interests of working people every single day. But despite our best efforts, we've endured a generation of stagnant wages and collapsed benefits. A generation where the labor movement has been much more about defense than about offense, where our horizons are shrinking rather than growing. But the future of the labor movement depends on moving forward, on innovating and changing the way that we work, on being open to all working people and giving voice to all workers, even when our laws and our employers seek to divide us from one another. And that's something that we're working on every single day. The AFL-CIO is building new ways for working people to organize themselves and new models for collective bargaining. We've created Working America, a 3 million member community-based union growing in working class neighborhoods. This is one of the signal accomplishments of my predecessor, John Sweeney. John, and I have to tell you, I'm very, very proud and honored to have you here with us today. Please stand up. We're proud of our alliance with Worker Centers movement that links movements to the AFL-CIO with hundreds of grassroots workers organizations around the country. And we're also working with community allies to strengthen the voice and the bargaining power of low-wage workers in Los Angeles car washes, some of the worst paid and worst treated workers in this country. Next week, AFL-CIO Executive Vice President Arlene Holt-Baker, who's right over here, will lead the labor movement's commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, continuing the great work that she's done over so many years on behalf of the most vulnerable in our society. And not far from Greensboro, we've been working with unemployed African American day laborers and their worker center, desperately trying to keep alive the dream launched in those very sit-ins. In San Diego last week, I visited a pre-apprenticeship program formed by local labor movement to create career paths for at-risk youth. In Los Angeles, I saw a remarkable community-based labor management training program created by the electrical workers that's focused on green jobs. See, these programs demonstrate the tremendous benefits that are possible when labor and business come together to solve problems jointly. And when I was there, I met with a man who was once homeless, and he was 19 days away from becoming a journeyman electrician. Young man named Nakaya. And he said to me that the union gave me a chance to go from no life to the hope for a middle-class life. It didn't just teach me to get a job. It taught me how to be a man. And then I talked to hotel workers, members of Unite Here, many of them immigrants, on strike to keep hotel jobs from falling back into poverty. And to union members with PhDs, fighting to prevent California's budget catastrophe from cratering not only their jobs, but the education of their state's children. As I did that, I thought of my father on strike in the coal fields when I was a boy. And I was reminded of this basic truth. A job is a good job because workers fight to make it a good job. And it doesn't matter if the job is in a coal mine or in a classroom or in a car wash. And that, my friends, is why unions are needed today more than ever before. See, I grew up in a little town in southwestern Pennsylvania, and I was surrounded by the legacy of my parents and my grandparents. My grandfathers and my father and his brothers and their fellow workers went into the mines that were death traps to work for wages that weren't enough to buy food and clothes for our families. They and the union they built made those jobs into middle-class jobs. And when I went into the mine, it was a good job. A good job meant possibilities for me. Possibilities that my mother moved heaven and earth to make real. That took me from Penn State to law school to this very podium. What's our legacy? What's the legacy of those of us who are helping the world, shaping the world our children and our grandchildren will inhabit? Is our government laying the foundations that young people need right now? Do workplaces offer hope? Do they even offer work? Are we building a world that we'll be proud to hand over to our children? Are the voices of the young, of the future, being heard? In September, I was elected president of the AFL-CIO together with Secretary Treasurer Liz Schuler, who is here with me on my left, and Executive Vice President Arlene Holt-Baker. Liz is the youngest principal officer in the AFL-CIO history. I asked her to lead a program of outreach to young workers. As part of the effort, the AFL-CIO conducted a study of young workers between the ages of 18 and 34, comparing their economic standing and attitudes and hopes with those of a similar survey that was conducted 10 years ago. The findings were shocking. They revealed the lost decade of young workers in America. Lower wages, education deferred. Things were so bad that 1 in 3 of these 18 to 34-year-olds is currently living at home with their parents because they can't afford to live alone. Now, the desperation I heard in this survey and the voices of the proud, hard-working Americans fills me with a sense of urgency. An urgency that should be shared by every last elected official here in Washington and across the country. As a country and a movement, our challenge is to build a new economy that can restore working people's expectations and renew their hopes. If you were laid off because of what Wall Street did to our economy, it's not your fault. A dead-end job with no benefits is not the best that our country can do for its citizens. So what went wrong with our economy? Well, you could say it as simple as we built a low-wage, high-consumption economy and tried to bridge the contradiction with debt. And there's a lot of truth in that simplicity. But if we're going to understand what is wrong in a way that will help us understand how to fix it, I think we need a little more detail. See, a generation ago, our nation's policymakers embarked on a campaign of radical deregulation and corporate empowerment, one that celebrated private greed over public service. Now, the AFL-CIO warned of the dangers of that path. Trade policies that rewarded and accelerated outsourcing, financial deregulation designed to promote speculation, and the dismantling of our pension and our healthcare system. We warned that the middle class could not survive in such an economy, that growing inequality would inevitably shrink the American pie, that we were borrowing from the rest of the world at an unsustainable pace, that busts would follow bubbles and that our country would be worse off in the end. These policies culminated in the worst economic decade in living memory. We suffered a net loss of jobs, the housing market collapsed, real wages fell, and more children fell into poverty. And the enormous growth in equality during that decade yielded mediocre growth overall. Now, this is not a portrait of a cyclical recession, but of a nation with profound, unaddressed structural economic problems